My name is Edward Black. I'm in my late 30s now, but when this story begins, I was 34, working in a corporate environment that prized optics over substance, certainty over curiosity. On paper, I was reliable, useful, the kind of person people describe as solid when they can't think of anything more specific. I lived in the space between being known and being noticed. Most people underestimated me in a very particular way. They assumed my quiet meant agreement, that my patience meant permission, that because I didn't push myself into the center of the room, I must not have anything worth protecting. I was often mistaken for someone who would absorb pressure indefinitely, who would adjust, no matter how sharply the ground shifted beneath his feet. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about winning. And it definitely isn't about shouting the truth louder than anyone else. It's about what happens when something essential is taken from you without explanation, when HR called it a restructuring. I called it an execution, and you're expected to disappear politely. It's about the long silence that follows, and what grows inside that silence if you let it. When it happened, there were no raised voices, no dramatic meeting, just a calendar invite, a neutral expression, and a careful choice of words that avoided responsibility. My role vanished overnight, replaced by silence and locked systems. Access gone, purpose erased. And no one seemed particularly interested in explaining why. What follows is a slow story, a quiet one. There are no villains twisting, no sudden miracles, no satisfying outbursts. Instead, there is observation, memory, restraint. It's the story of realizing how you were seen and deciding, without announcing it, to change the terms. Over the next hour, I'll take you through how I was perceived, how small dismissals accumulate, how silence can be misread, and how preparation often looks exactly like compliance to those who aren't paying attention. You'll hear about choices made without witnesses, leverage discovered without celebration, and a confrontation that never raised its voice. I'm telling this as honestly as I can, not to settle scores, but to document something many people experience and rarely articulate. The moment you understand that staying quiet doesn't mean staying still. If you've ever felt yourself slowly edited out of a room you helped build, if you've ever wondered whether dignity can survive loss, then you'll understand why this story mattered enough to tell. Before we go any further, let me ask you something gently and without expectation. Have you ever been underestimated in a way that changed you? I didn't join the company with ambition blazing in my chest. I joined with something quieter, an instinct to build things that worked. Systems, processes, bridges between departments that didn't speak the same language. I was good at seeing how small failures echoed into larger ones, and even better at fixing them before anyone noticed they'd existed at all. To them, that made me dependable. Not impressive, not threatening, just there. In meetings, my name came up attached to phrases like, "Edward will handle it," or "Let's loop Edward in. He's good with details." I was the person managers relied on when something had already gone wrong and needed to be stabilized quickly and discreetly. The person who stayed late without making a show of it. The person who documented decisions others preferred to keep verbal. If there was a hierarchy of visibility, I lived just below the surface. People didn't dislike me. That's important. Dislike requires friction, and I rarely created any. I asked clear questions. I delivered on time. I didn't gossip, didn't posture, didn't compete for attention. In a culture that rewarded confident theatre, my restraint read as a lack of hunger. I remember once, during a quarterly review, my manager praised my consistency. He smiled when he said it, like it was a compliment. But I noticed what didn't follow. No mention of leadership, no discussion of growth. Just an assumption that I would continue to be exactly where I was, doing exactly what I did, indefinitely. At the time, I accepted that framing. I told myself visibility was overrated, that influence didn't need an audience, that being indispensable was safer than being prominent. These were rationalizations, but they weren't lies, not entirely. I was useful. I was trusted. And in subtle ways, I was everywhere, embedded in workflows, approvals, dependencies no one had mapped but me. Still, the way people spoke around me mattered. Ideas I raised quietly would resurface later, louder, credited to someone else. Decisions I warned against would be revisited months later as unexpected outcomes. When leadership discussed strategy, they invited the voices that sounded confident, not the ones that sounded certain. I became skilled at noticing these patterns without reacting to them. That's the thing about being underestimated. It doesn't arrive as an insult. It arrives as an omission, as the absence of curiosity, as the slow realization that no one is asking what you want next, because they assume you'll accept whatever is given. I was seen as stable, and stability is often confused with immobility. There was also an unspoken role I played socially. I absorbed tension. If a project was behind, I'd take on the unglamorous work to catch it up. If two teams were in conflict, I translated between them. I was a buffer, a shock absorber, someone who reduced friction without claiming credit. Over time, people stopped noticing the friction at all. Looking back, I understand why they misread me. I didn't correct them. I didn't narrate my contributions. I believed that outcomes spoke for themselves. But outcomes are anonymous by nature. They don't advocate. They don't remember. And so I became familiar with the way furniture is familiar. Missed only when it's gone, and even then, often blamed for the inconvenience. There's a particular loneliness in that position. Not dramatic, not painful enough to demand change, just quiet, manageable, easy to live inside. If you had asked anyone at the company who Edward Black was, they would have answered without hesitation. But if you asked them what would happen if I left, if my role disappeared, they would have paused, then shrugged, then said something like, "We'd figure it out." At the time, Sam, I believed that being reliable was enough. That respect would eventually follow usefulness. That staying calm, staying quiet, staying steady would earn me a kind of invisible protection. What I didn't understand yet was this. When people only see you as a function, they don't think twice about deleting you. And when that happens, they're always surprised by what breaks. The first sign wasn't dramatic. It almost never is. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, buried inside a meeting that had already run 10 minutes over. We were reviewing a process change, one I'd helped design, refine, and document over the course of 3 months. Nothing flashy, just a cleaner handoff between teams that had been stepping on each other for years. When my turn came to explain the final step, my manager interrupted. "Let's keep this high level," he said, glancing at the clock. "We don't need to get into the weeds." The room nodded along. Laptops clicked. Pens moved. And just like that, the part I owned was dismissed. Not rejected, not challenged, simply skipped. I stopped mid-sentence. At the time, I told myself it was nothing. Meetings were rushed. Everyone was busy. No one had meant anything by it. But I remember the exact sensation in my chest. Not anger, not embarrassment. Something thinner. A subtle contraction, like a thread being pulled loose. What stayed with me wasn't the interruption. It was what happened later. 2 weeks after that meeting, an issue surfaced. A small one at first. A delay between approvals caused a downstream team to miss a deadline. Exactly the kind of thing the weeds had addressed. The conversation came back around, this time with urgency. Suddenly, leadership wanted details. My manager looked at me and said, "Why wasn't this flagged?" I answered calmly. I explained that it had been, briefly, and deprioritized in the meeting. I even referenced the documentation I'd shared afterward. He nodded, non-committal, then turned back to the group. "Okay," he said. "Let's fix it going forward. No apology, no acknowledgement." The moment passed. That was the cut. Small, clean. Easy to ignore if you wanted to. And I did want to ignore it. I told myself I was being sensitive, that I shouldn't expect recognition for every contribution. What mattered was the work, not the credit. These were the same beliefs that had kept me steady for years, but something had changed. Not in how they treated me, but in how I noticed it. After that, there were more moments. A request for input that never came. A meeting invite was forwarded instead of sent directly. A decision was made about my domain without asking me, then handed to me to implement. Each instance was defensible on its own, plausible, accidental. Together they formed a pattern. What made it worse wasn't the behavior, it was the consensus around it. No one else seemed to register the shift, or if they did, they accepted it as normal. This was just how things worked. People spoke over each other. Priorities changed. Roles evolved. But I remembered the past. I remembered when my perspective had been sought, not tolerated. When I'd been looped in early, not after the fact. The contrast was subtle enough to doubt myself, which is often the point. I didn't confront anyone. That's important. I didn't pull my manager aside or ask for clarification. I continued to do my job the same way I always had. Thoroughly, quietly. Without complaint. But I started paying attention. I noticed how often urgency replaced respect, how efficiency became a reason to exclude, how decisions were made faster when fewer voices were involved, even if they were the wrong voices. And I noticed something else too. No one was malicious. This wasn't a campaign. It was entropy, the natural outcome of a system that rewards speed and confidence over depth and memory. I was being edged out, not because I was disliked, but because I was easy to overlook. That realization hurt more than anger would have, because it meant there was no villain to confront, no single moment to point to, just a series of choices made by people who assumed I would adapt, absorb, and continue. And I did, at least on the surface. But internally, something had shifted. A line had been crossed so quietly that no one noticed it being drawn. Except me. That's the thing about the first small cut. It doesn't make you bleed. It makes you aware that you can. After the first small cut, I did what most people do when something feels wrong but not wrong enough to challenge. I adapted, not outwardly. Outwardly, nothing changed. I still arrived early, still responded promptly, still delivered clean work that required no explanation. If anything, I became easier to work with, less insistent, more accommodating, careful not to slow anyone down with nuance they hadn't asked for. Internally, though, I began editing myself. I shortened my explanations. I stopped volunteering context unless explicitly requested. I let decisions pass that I would have questioned before. Not because I agreed with them, but because I'd learned what happened when I spoke up. Polite nods, deferred conversations, eventual omission. It's strange how quickly the mind learns these patterns. You tell yourself you're being efficient, that you're respecting hierarchy, that this is just how mature professionals operate. And slowly, you normalize. What once would have bothered you, meetings became quieter for me. I was still present, still listening, still taking notes. But my role shifted. I became reactive instead of proactive. I waited to be asked. And when I wasn't, I filled the silence with compliance. What I didn't realize at the time was that this silence was being interpreted, not as thoughtfulness, not as a restraint, but as consent. The more I absorbed, the more people assumed I could absorb. Deadlines tightened. Scope expanded without discussion. Decisions arrived fully formed, framed as fait accompli. My name stayed attached to outcomes, but not to direction. And every time something went wrong, the same pattern repeated. A brief scramble, a question asked too late, a correction was made quietly, then forward motion without reflection. I started to hear phrases like, "We'll loop Edward in once it's finalized," or "Edward can adjust for that." My role wasn't to shape the path. It was to smooth it after others had already chosen it. The dangerous part was how reasonable it all sounded. No one was shouting. No one was disrespectful in a way that could be quoted. There were no emails I could point to and say, "This is the moment." Everything lived in tone, timing, and omission. That makes it easy to doubt yourself. There were days I told myself I was overthinking, that this was just the ebb and flow of work, that I should be grateful to have stability in a volatile environment. After all, people still relied on me. They still trusted my execution. But trust without influence is a narrow form of security. I noticed it most clearly when new hires joined. Confident, articulate, unburdened by context. They asked questions I'd stopped asking. Challenged assumptions I'd learned to navigate around. And they were rewarded for it. Not because they were more capable, but because they were louder earlier. I watched this happen without resentment. If anything, I felt tired. Tired of calibrating myself to rooms that had already decided how much of me they wanted. Tired of translating complexity into sound bites that would be ignored. Tired of being the adult in systems that preferred speed to understanding. And still, I stayed quiet. Not out of fear, but out of habit. Disrespect, once normalized, stops feeling like an attack. It starts feeling like gravity. Something you work around instead of against. Something you accept as the cost of existing where you do. The problem is, gravity doesn't stay constant. It increases. The more I adapted, the less visible my original value became. People didn't remember that the systems worked because I was there. They just remembered that they worked. And when something works consistently, it fades into the background. I was becoming background. At some point, I realized I was no longer being underestimated. I was being categorized, filed away, considered solved. And when someone believes you're solved, they stop paying attention. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me alert. Because the moment people stop watching you is the moment you can change without being noticed. At the time, I didn't know what I would change, or when, or how. I only knew this. Continuing exactly as I was would eventually make me disappear, and I wasn't ready for that. There's a moment, quiet, almost clinical, when you realize the room has already decided who you are, not who you could be, not who you used to be, but the role you're expected to play consistently, without deviation. For me, that realization came not in a meeting, but in a one-on-one. My manager leaned back in his chair, hands folded, and said something he clearly thought was reassuring. "You're someone we can always count on," he said. "You don't create friction." He smiled after that, as if he'd offered me a gift. I nodded, thanked him, took notes, but inside something clarified. I wasn't being praised for judgment or foresight or leadership. I was being praised for absorbency, for flexibility, for my willingness to take on complexity without asking others to slow down or explain themselves. I was the reliable one, the safe one, the invisible one. That was the role. I was expected to stabilize what others destabilized, to translate vague directives into executable plans, to carry institutional memory without ever invoking it as authority, to make leadership look decisive by cleaning up the uncertainty they left behind. And as long as I stayed within that role, I was valued. The boundaries were clear once I saw them. I could advise, but not challenge. I could fix, but not redesign. I could support, but not lead. Any time I drifted toward the edges of that box, the system corrected me. Not harshly, gently. A delayed response here, a redirected conversation there, a reminder to stay focused on execution. The thing about roles like this is that they're rarely assigned explicitly. They emerge through repetition, through what's rewarded and what's ignored, through who gets invited early and who gets informed late. I began to notice how others interacted with me. They brought me problems, not ideas, tasks, not questions. When I spoke, they listened politely, but rarely built on what I said. My contributions were endpoints, not starting points. I was a closer, not a catalyst, and the more effective I was in that role, the harder it became to imagine me in any other. That's the trap of competence without visibility. It calcifies. I saw it in how decisions flowed. Strategy moved vertically, executives to directors to managers, then horizontally among the visibly ambitious. Execution flowed downward, toward me, toward people like me. We were the ones who made it real, but not the ones who made it decided. I don't blame anyone for this. Systems behave the way they're designed to behave. And I had, in my own way, reinforced the design. Every time I chose restraint over assertion, I taught people what to expect from me. Still, there was cost to us. There was a cost. I began to feel like a translator who was no longer allowed to speak their native language. Like a witness whose testimony had been pre-edited for brevity and comfort. The work was still meaningful, but my relationship to it had changed. I was no longer shaping outcomes, I was maintaining them. And maintenance, no matter how skilled, rarely earns protection. What struck me most was how complete the role assignment was. No one checked whether I wanted something different. No one asked where I saw myself in a year. The assumption was stability, continuity, more of the same. That's when I understood something crucial. They weren't planning to move me forward. They were planning to keep me where I was, indefinitely. And in environments that worship momentum, anything stationary eventually becomes expendable. At the time, I didn't resist this role. I didn't argue. I didn't make a case for myself. I accepted it. But acceptance doesn't always mean agreement. Sometimes it's just observation, long enough to understand the shape of the cage. The day something shifted didn't announce itself. There was no argument, no realization delivered in a flash of insight, no sentence that echoed in my head like a verdict. It was an ordinary day, indistinguishable from the dozens that came before it. That's why it mattered. I was sitting at my desk late in the afternoon, reviewing a document I'd been asked to clean up. It was a proposal drafted by a leadership team that had already been approved in principle, despite containing contradictions I could see in the first 2 pages. My task wasn't to challenge the logic, it was to make it readable. As I worked, I noticed how often I was correcting not just grammar, but meaning. Rewriting sentences so they didn't conflict. Softening claims that couldn't be supported. Adding caveats that would protect the company later, even though no one had asked for them. This wasn't new. I'd done this kind of work for years. What was new was the clarity with which I saw it. I wasn't improving the proposal. I was insulating the people who wrote it, absorbing the risk so they wouldn't have to revisit their decisions, making something fragile appear solid, and no one would ever know. I leaned back in my chair and stopped typing. For the first time, I asked myself a question I'd been avoiding. If I disappeared tomorrow, what would they lose? Not in theory, not in abstract terms like experience or continuity, but concretely. What would break? What would stall? What would quietly fail without anyone understanding why? The answers came easily. Too easily. I could list dependencies no one else tracked. Informal agreements that lived only in my inbox. Historical decisions that explained why things were the way they were and why certain shortcuts would backfire months later. And I realized something else too. None of that knowledge was protected. It lived in me, not in systems. And because I'd been so good at smoothing over issues, there had never been a reason to document the fragility. The organization had come to believe it was more resilient than it actually was. That's when the shift happened, not outwardly. Outwardly, I kept working. I finished the document, sent it back with minimal commentary, logged off at my usual time. But internally, a line had been crossed. I stopped assuming that effort would be reciprocated. I stopped believing that patience would be rewarded. I stopped confusing stability with safety. For the first time, I saw my silence not as virtue, but as exposure. And with that came a strange sense of calm. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel wronged. I felt awake. As if I'd been moving through the same rooms for years and had finally noticed the exits. That night, I went home and opened the black leather-bound notebook I'd carried for years but rarely used. Most of its pages were blank. I'd kept it more out of habit than necessity. I wrote one sentence on the first page. What would happen if I stopped protecting them? I didn't answer it. Not yet. I didn't make plans. I didn't fantasize about outcomes. I simply acknowledged the question and closed the notebook. From that day on, my behavior remained identical to anyone watching. Same responsiveness, same tone, same output. But my intention had changed. I was no longer working to preserve appearances. I was working to understand leverage. And that kind of work doesn't announce itself. It begins quietly, with observation, with memory, with the decision to stop volunteering what no one knows they're missing. The shift wasn't dramatic. It was deliberate. Before, my silence had been reflexive. I held my tongue because it seemed professional, because it avoided friction, because I believed that restraint signaled maturity. I stayed quiet the way people do when they trust the system to notice what matters. After the shift, silence became something else. It became intentional. I didn't withdraw. That would have been noticed. I didn't disengage. That would have raised questions. Instead, I became precise. I spoke only when asked. I answered exactly the question in front of me. No more, no less. Where I used to offer context, I now offer clarity. Where I used to flag risks early, I now document them neutrally. Where I used to connect dots, I let them remain separate. From the outside, I looked easier than ever to work with. People mistook this for compliance. Meetings moved faster. Decisions were made with confidence. I watched as assumptions hardened into plans without resistance. And each time I noted, not the decision itself, but who made it, who endorsed it, and what information had not been requested. This wasn't passive-aggressive. It wasn't sabotage. I didn't withhold anything I was explicitly asked for. I simply stopped compensating for gaps others didn't want to see. That distinction mattered to me. Silence, when chosen, has a weight to it. It creates space. And in that space, systems reveal themselves. I began to see how dependent the organization was on invisible labor. How often decisions relied on the assumption that someone, usually me, would quietly resolve the consequences later. How risk was managed not through foresight, but through expectation. Expectation that I would adapt. Expectation that I would fix. Expectation that I would not say no. The more I observed, the clearer the pattern became. Leadership believed speed was strength. They valued decisiveness over accuracy. And because I had spent years smoothing the edges, they believed their instincts were sound. My silence reinforced that belief. I kept records. Not in any formal system, just in my notebook. Dates, decisions, ownership, language used. Nothing inflammatory, just facts. I noticed how often phrases like, "we'll figure it out later," or "Edward can adjust," appeared in conversations where I wasn't present. And I noticed something else. No one checked in anymore. Not about workload, not about trajectory, not about sustainability. I was assumed to be fine, always fine. My quiet competence had become a kind of emotional camouflage. That invisibility worked both ways, because no one was watching me closely. No one noticed when I stopped filling in the blanks. When I allowed ambiguity to remain unresolved. when I let minor inefficiencies persist instead of preemptively correcting them. Things didn't break, not immediately, they rarely do, but they became more fragile. And fragility, when layered, eventually becomes exposure. I didn't rush this process. I didn't accelerate it. I let time do what time does best, reveal the cost of unexamined assumptions. There were moments when I considered speaking up again, when I saw a path narrowing and knew exactly how to widen it. Old instincts die hard, but each time, I asked myself the same question I'd written in my notebook. Am I protecting them or protecting myself? More often than not, the answer was uncomfortable. So I stayed quiet, not as an act of defiance, but as an act of alignment. With my values, with my understanding of the system, with the reality that dignity sometimes requires restraint, not assertion. They continued to mistake my silence for weakness, for lack of ambition, for contentment, for resignation. I let them, because there is a difference between being silent because you feel powerless and being silent because you are watching. And I was watching everything. What they never noticed wasn't a single action. It was an accumulation. While everything looked the same on the surface, same cadence, same deliverables, same calm tone, I had begun doing something different underneath. I wasn't preparing an exit. I wasn't plotting a confrontation. I was doing something far less dramatic and far more decisive. I was learning the system the way it actually functioned, not the way it described itself. For years, I'd known pieces of it. Now I began to map the whole, not in a formal diagram, but in my own way, carefully, patiently, without alerting anyone to the fact that I was paying closer attention than ever before. I tracked dependencies that had never been documented because Edward handles that. I noted which approvals were symbolic and which were essential. I observed how often policy bent under pressure and who was allowed to apply that pressure. Most importantly, I started distinguishing between authority and reliance. Authority was visible, titles, announcements, org charts. Reliance was quiet. It showed up in late-night messages, in forwarded emails with no context. In the subtle relief in someone's voice when I said, "I'll take care of it." Reliance left fingerprints. I began documenting, not aggressively, not obsessively, but consistently. Decisions that were framed as collective but made by individuals. Risks that were acknowledged verbally but never recorded. Workarounds that had become permanent because no one wanted to revisit the original decision. I didn't share these notes with anyone. I didn't even organize them particularly well. That wasn't the point. The point was memory. Organizations forget. People rotate. Context evaporates. I had been the bridge for so long that no one realized how much crossed it every day. I also started asking different kinds of questions, not challenging ones, clarifying ones, just so I'm aligned. Who owns this long term? Is this assumption documented anywhere? Should we note this risk or is it considered acceptable? These questions never slowed things down. They were answered quickly, casually, and often inconsistently. And every answer told me something. I learned where accountability dissolved, where decisions became foggy enough that responsibility could always be reassigned later. I learned which leaders needed plausible deniability and which genuinely believed in what they were doing. And through all of this, no one suspected a thing, because I didn't change my demeanor. I didn't grow cold. I didn't become cynical. I remained calm, helpful, and measured. The version of Edward they thought they knew was still there, just no longer overextended. What they also didn't notice was how I began to reduce my footprint, not by disengaging, but by consolidating. I quietly ensured that my contributions were clearly traceable, that my inputs were recorded, that my work lived in places where attribution couldn't be erased by accident. This wasn't self-promotion, it was self-preservation. I stopped carrying knowledge exclusively in my head. I stopped resolving issues in side conversations that left no record. If something mattered, it went into writing. If it didn't, I let it pass. That alone changed the dynamic. Suddenly, people were more careful about what they asked for, about what they committed to, about what they assumed I would absorb. And still, no alarm bells rang, because none of this looked like resistance. It looked like professionalism, like maturity, like exactly what someone in my role should be doing. They never noticed the preparation because preparation doesn't announce itself. It looks consistent. It sounds like neutrality. It feels like nothing at all until the moment it's needed. By the time anyone sensed a shift, it would already be too late to trace it back to the beginning, because the groundwork wasn't laid in a single moment. It was laid in dozens of quiet ones. The reveal didn't come as a rush of adrenaline. There was no surge of triumph, no sharp intake of breath when everything suddenly made sense. What I felt instead was something steadier, heavier, like the moment you realize the ground you've been standing on isn't solid, but you're already positioned somewhere safer. It happened late one evening, long after most people had logged off. I was reviewing a sequence of decisions connected to a project that had quietly become critical. Not officially high priority, just important enough that failure would ripple outward in ways no one wanted to explain. I wasn't looking for leverage. I was verifying alignment. That's when I noticed it. A contradiction between what had been approved, what had been communicated, and what had actually been implemented. On its own, it was manageable, correctable, the kind of thing I used to fix automatically. But as I traced it backward, the picture widened. The approval chain didn't match the responsibility chain. The documentation didn't reflect the reality of execution. And the risk, significant, unavoidable, had never been formally accepted by anyone with the authority to do so. I sat there for a long time, reading the same messages again and again. What I realized was not that someone had made a mistake. Mistakes were normal. What I realized was that the system relied on people like me to quietly absorb the consequences of those mistakes, without record, without acknowledgement, without protection. And for the first time, I saw exactly where that reliance became exposure. If this issue surfaced publicly, it wouldn't land where it belonged. It would land where it always did, on execution, on process, on the invisible layers that connected intent to outcome, on me, unless the record told a different story. That was the reveal, not power over anyone, but clarity about where responsibility truly lived and how poorly it was documented. I didn't feel excited, I felt sober, because leverage, when you find it, doesn't feel like a weapon. It feels like a responsibility, something that demands precision, not impulse. I didn't act on it, I didn't mention it. I didn't even adjust my behavior immediately. I just made sure the facts existed. I organized my notes. I aligned timelines. I saved copies of approvals, messages, and assumptions. Nothing confidential, nothing illicit. Just the unbroken chain of how decisions had moved, and where accountability had quietly fallen away. I wasn't building a case. I was building a mirror, and what that mirror reflected was unsettling, not because it showed malice, but because it showed how easily systems confuse trust with invisibility. That night, I closed my notebook and understood something with absolute certainty. If things continued as they were, someone would eventually need a clean line between intent and consequence. And for the first time, that line didn't have to run through me. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel powerful. I felt clear. And clarity changes what options you're willing to consider. Clarity doesn't demand action. That was the first thing I had to remind myself. Just because I could act didn't mean I should. Just because I understood the system didn't mean I needed to disrupt it. There were still multiple paths available to me, and not all of them led through conflict. I took my time considering them. One option was the familiar one. Continue as I had, armed with knowledge but committed to restraint. Protect myself quietly. Ensure that if things went wrong, the record would reflect reality. This path required patience, and it came with a certain moral comfort. No waves, no consequences, just insulation. Another option was to speak up, to bring the contradictions into the open, to ask for clarity and accountability before the system forced the issue. This would have been framed as leadership, as a responsibility. But I knew how that story often ended. The system didn't reward the messenger, it reassigned the problem. I'd seen it happen before. There was also the option of leaving, of finding another role, another environment, another version of myself that didn't require this level of vigilance. Clean, simple, tempting. But departure without resolution would have meant erasing the truth along with me. And then there was the final option, the one I didn't think about at first because it felt irreversible. To stop compensating entirely. To let the system experience the consequences of its own design. Not through sabotage or exposure, but through absence. Not absence from the company, absence from protection. This wasn't about teaching anyone a lesson. It was about choosing not to carry what wasn't mine anymore. About letting responsibility settle where it belonged, without interference. Once I saw that option clearly, the others began to fade, because the question was no longer, what should I do? It was, what am I willing to continue being responsible for? I thought about the years I'd spent smoothing outcomes. About the trust I'd placed in people who never questioned how much I carried. About the role I'd accepted without realizing how narrow it had become. I thought about dignity, not pride, not ego. Just the quiet dignity of knowing where you end and where others begin. The decision wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with a surge of emotion or a finality that demanded acknowledgement. It came with a steady sense of alignment. I chose the irreversible path, not because it was bold, but because it was honest. From that moment on, I would do my job, no more, no less. I would execute what was assigned. I would document what was decided. And I would no longer shield the system from the outcomes of its own shortcuts. I didn't announce this decision. I didn't hint at it. I didn't change my tone or my pace. I simply stopped crossing lines that had never been mine to cross. And once that decision was made, everything else became a matter of timing. Once the decision was made, there was no rush. That's something people misunderstand about irreversible choices. They imagine a sharp turn, a visible break. But the most effective shifts happen so quietly that, from the outside, nothing appears to change at all. I kept showing up. I kept delivering. I kept responding with the same calm professionalism I always had. The difference was in what I no longer did. I stopped pre-solving problems that hadn't been acknowledged. I stopped translating vague intent into workable reality without confirmation. I stopped treating ambiguity as my personal responsibility. Every task I received, I executed exactly as scoped. If something was unclear, I asked for clarification, in writing. If a risk was implied but not stated, I documented it neutrally and moved forward only once ownership was explicit. No confrontation, no warnings, just alignment. From the outside, this looked like maturity, like someone finally respecting the process. No one questioned it, because nothing I did could be framed as resistance. I was still efficient, still polite, still dependable, but the system began to feel different. Decisions took slightly longer. Approvals required more thought. People hesitated where they used to assume, not because I had slowed them down, but because the safety net had quietly thinned. I noticed how often my name stopped appearing as a solution to unfinished thinking. Where people used to say, "Edward will figure it out," they now had to figure it out themselves, or admit they hadn't yet. That admission made some uncomfortable. I also began to formalize boundaries that had previously been informal. Handoffs were documented. Dependencies were named. Ownership was assigned clearly, even when that clarity felt awkward in the moment. No one objected. They simply adjusted. And in that adjustment, something became visible. Small cracks appeared. Not failures, not crises, but friction points that had always existed and been quietly absorbed. A missed assumption here, a delayed approval there. Nothing catastrophic, just enough to register. Still, no one connected it to me, because I hadn't done anything. I had simply stopped doing what no one knew I was doing. There was a strange calm in this phase, a sense of inevitability. I wasn't steering events. I was allowing them to follow their natural course. And that course led away from me, not because I was withdrawing, but because the system was finally being asked to support its own weight. I continued to keep records, clean, factual, emotionless, not to protect myself from accusation, but to preserve truth. If questions came later, the answers would already exist. As weeks passed, the organization didn't feel threatened. It felt slightly off balance, like a building adjusting to a load shift it didn't realize had occurred. And still, no one looked in my direction. That was the final confirmation. I hadn't been central in the way they thought. I'd been central in the way they never noticed. And once you understand that, silence stops feeling passive. It feels precise. The consequences didn't arrive with an alarm. They arrived in confusion. A project slipped by a few days, then a week. No one panicked at first. Delays happened. Explanations were offered. Dependencies were blamed. It all sounded reasonable until it started happening more often. Questions began circling without landing anywhere. Did we confirm that assumption? Who signed off on this? I thought this was already handled. They weren't accusatory questions. They were unsettled ones. The kind people ask when they expect an answer to already exist and discover instead a gap. I watched these moments quietly, not with satisfaction, with recognition, because I knew exactly where the gaps had come from. They were the spaces I used to fill without being asked, the risks I used to soften, the inconsistencies I used to reconcile before anyone else had to see them. Now they were visible. Still, no one connected the dots. They added meetings. They created checklists. They asked for updates. But something was off. The same confidence that once propelled decisions forward now stalled when outcomes didn't line up cleanly. People spoke more cautiously. Emails grew longer. Language became hedged. What struck me most was how personal the confusion felt to them. They weren't asking, what changed? They were asking, why isn't this working as it used to? The system had been working through someone. not because of itself. And now that difference was beginning to matter. A director pulled me aside one afternoon, not urgently, not angrily. "Things feel heavier lately," he said, "more complicated." I nodded. "There's been a lot of movement." That was all. I wasn't being evasive. I wasn't hiding information. I was simply reflecting what was true. Complexity had always been there. It just hadn't been visible. Soon, small losses accumulated. Extra hours spent revisiting decisions. Missed opportunities because approvals lagged. Tension between teams who thought the other was responsible. Nothing dramatic enough to escalate, but enough to erode confidence. And still no one blamed me. That's the irony of invisible labor. When it stops, people don't immediately miss the person. They miss the feeling of things working. And feelings don't point to causes. I stayed consistent. When asked, I explained my scope clearly. When assigned work, I completed it thoroughly. When risks emerged, I documented them and waited for direction. Some people began to sense that something had shifted, but they couldn't articulate it, because I hadn't changed who I was. I had changed what I carried, and the weight I set down was now being felt by everyone else. This wasn't vindication. It was inevitable. By the time they realized something was wrong, they were already speaking in the past tense. Not openly. Not yet. But the language had shifted. Conversations began with "we should have," and "in hindsight," phrases people use when the present no longer feels stable enough to stand in. The organization didn't collapse. That's important. Nothing so dramatic happened. What changed was subtler and far more unsettling to the people inside it. Confidence fractured. Decisions that once moved quickly now circled through committees. Approvals that used to feel procedural became cautious, layered with qualifiers. People asked for alignment not because they needed it, but because they were afraid of being the one left holding responsibility. The system had lost its quiet absorber, and now everyone felt the impact directly. I started receiving messages that felt different from before. Not requests, check-ins. "Hey, quick question. Are you seeing this too? Just wanted to sanity check something with you. Can you help us think through a few risks?" These weren't assigned tasks, they were fishing lines. People were trying to re-establish the old dynamic without naming it. Hoping I would step back into the familiar role and quietly make things safe again. I didn't refuse. I clarified. I asked who made the decision. I asked whether the risk had been accepted. I asked what success looked like in writing. Each time, the conversation slowed. Not because my questions were unreasonable, but because the answers were unclear. And once clarity was required, it couldn't be undone. Leadership meetings became tense. Not loud, just careful. People spoke with an awareness that their words might matter later. That accountability might stick. That was new. At one point, HR circulated a neutral-sounding message about process refinement and role evaluation. It was framed as proactive, strategic, necessary. But I could feel the panic underneath. They weren't fixing a problem. They were trying to contain uncertainty. And uncertainty, once exposed, doesn't go back into hiding. What surprised me was how quickly they stopped looking forward and started looking around. For someone to stabilize things, to restore the old rhythm, to quietly take on the excess weight. That's when the realization landed for them. Not all at once, but in pieces. I was no longer doing that work, not because I couldn't, but because it had never been formally mine, and it was too late to pretend otherwise. The systems they had leaned on weren't designed to carry themselves. They had relied on trust without structure, speed without clarity, confidence without record. Fixing that would require slowing down, admitting mistakes, reassigning ownership, none of which could be done quietly. I watched all of this with a strange mix of distance and empathy, because I knew how easy it was to believe the system worked, right up until the moment it didn't. They weren't malicious, they weren't incompetent, they were unprepared for accountability. And once accountability becomes visible, you can't negotiate it away. That was the moment I understood something fully. They didn't need me back. They needed what I used to protect them from, and that couldn't be restored. The confrontation, when it finally came, was almost disappointingly calm. No raised voices, no accusations, no dramatic reveal where everything suddenly made sense to everyone involved. It arrived the way most things did in that organization, through a calendar invite with a neutral title and too many attendees. Alignment discussion. I entered the room carrying nothing but my notebook. No slides, no prepared statements. I didn't need them. They did most of the talking at first. Leadership spoke in careful language, circling the issue without naming it directly. They mentioned strain, misalignment, and unexpected complexity. They asked how I was feeling, whether my workload was manageable, whether there was anything I needed. The questions were gentle, almost kind. I listened, took notes, let the silence stretch just long enough after each question to signal that I was thinking, not hesitating. When I finally spoke, my voice was even. "I'm doing exactly what's been asked of me," I said. "Nothing more, nothing less." That sentence landed heavier than I expected. Someone asked what I meant, so I explained, not emotionally, not defensively, just factually. I described my scope as it had been defined. The decisions I executed, the risks I documented, the approvals I waited for. I referenced dates, messages, and agreed upon boundaries. Everything I said was already on record. There was no argument against it. Another manager tried a different angle. He spoke about ownership beyond titles, about stepping up when things are unclear. The implication was familiar. It was the old role, politely repackaged. I met his eyes and nodded. "I understand that expectation," I said. "I just want to make sure it's formalized. If I'm being asked to own outcomes beyond my scope, I'm happy to discuss how that responsibility is defined and supported." The room went quiet. Not tense, just still, because now the ask had a shape. And once something has a shape, it has to be accounted for. No one wanted to formalize it. Formalization meant acknowledgement. It meant admitting how much had been carried informally. It meant redistributing responsibility in ways that would be visible and uncomfortable. So the conversation softened again, drifted toward compromise, toward collaboration, toward vague assurances that things would improve. I didn't push. I simply said clarity would help, and that was it. The meeting ended without resolution. No promises, no threats. Just a shared understanding that something fundamental had changed, and that it couldn't be talked back into its old form. As I left the room, I felt no triumph, only relief, because for the first time I hadn't needed to prove anything. The truth had held its shape on its own. And that was enough. I didn't walk out of that meeting transformed. There was no internal monologue about reclaiming power or redefining myself in bold new terms. Change, in this case, was quieter than that, more grounded, less about becoming someone else, and more about no longer pretending to be someone I wasn't. I stayed, not indefinitely, but long enough to finish what was already in motion, long enough to transition my responsibilities cleanly, long enough to leave without bitterness and without leaving behind chaos that could be blamed on me. What changed wasn't my role, it was my relationship to it. I stopped measuring my worth by how much I could absorb. I stopped confusing calm with compliance. I stopped equating professionalism with silence at my own expense. I became deliberate. When I spoke, it was because something needed to be said, not because it was safe to say it. When I agreed to something, it was because the responsibility was clear and shared, not because I could manage the fallout alone. And when I stayed silent, it was no longer because I felt overlooked. It was because I'd already decided where my energy belonged. I didn't carry resentment with me. That would have tethered me to a version of the story that no longer fit. Instead, I carried understanding about systems, about people, about myself. I understood how easily reliability becomes invisibility, how often organizations confuse silence for stability, how quickly trust erodes when it's never examined. Most importantly, I understood my own limits, not in terms of capability, but in terms of consent. I no longer consented to being the place where unowned risk went to disappear. Today, I work differently, not louder, not more aggressively, just more clearly. I document early. I ask direct questions. I name boundaries before they're crossed instead of repairing them afterward. And when I sense the old pattern emerging, when someone assumes I'll quietly make something work, I pause, not to resist, but to choose. That choice has changed everything. I'm still calm, still measured, still capable, but I'm no longer invisible. Because visibility doesn't come from demanding attention. It comes from standing still long enough for the truth to be seen. If there's a lesson in all of this, it isn't about winning. It's about boundaries. For a long time, I believed that being useful was enough, that if I made myself indispensable, I would also be protected. That assumption is common, and it's understandable. We're taught that effort earns security, that loyalty compounds, that patience eventually pays. Sometimes it does, but sometimes what effort really earns is expectation, and expectation, when left unexamined, turns into entitlement. No one sat me down and decided to erase me. No one plotted to take advantage of my silence. What happened was quieter than that. A system learned what it could learn on and then leaned harder. Over time, responsibility drifted, not because anyone pushed it, but because someone kept catching it. That someone was me. The moment things changed wasn't when I spoke up. It wasn't when I found leverage. It wasn't even when the system began to strain. It was when I stopped carrying what was never formally mine. There's a difference between being generous and being extractable, between being calm and being compliant, between being trusted and being taken for granted. Those lines aren't drawn by others. They're drawn by us, slowly, quietly, through what we continue to accept. What surprised me most was that stepping back didn't make me smaller. It made the system clearer. It revealed where strength actually lived and where it had been quietly outsourced. And in that clarity, there was no need for revenge, no need for vindication, just alignment. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. Silence is not weakness unless it's chosen for you. Reliability is not safety unless it's reciprocated. And dignity doesn't require noise, only boundaries. If you've ever found yourself becoming invisible by being easy, if you've ever carried more than your share because you could, not because you should, I'd like to hear from you. Not for drama, not for validation, just to know you're not alone. Where in your life have you been quietly absorbing something that was never meant to be yours?